The wind of the high desert had teeth, and it bit with the spite of a thing that had been hungry for a long time. It was the first wind of the coming winter of 1876, a dry, scouring gale that whipped dust and the memory of cold from the peaks of the Red Butte Range down into the single, sorry street of the town that shared their name. The stagecoach groaned to a halt, its leather springs sighing in protest. For a moment, no one moved. The only life was the frantic dance of a single lantern hanging from a post, its flame a lonely gold against the immense, star-pricked black. Then the door swung open and May Collins descended, one hand gripping her worn leather suitcase, the other clutching the strap of her reticule as if it were an anchor. Inside the small bag, folded into a tight square, was the reason she had crossed half a continent. Sam's letter. The paper was already soft with handling, the desperate scrawl of his words a permanent imprint on her mind. Sheriff is bought. Dangerous. Come quick. She pulled her shawl tighter, the St. Louis wool feeling thin and useless against the Wyoming cold. The man who was supposed to meet her, a Mr. Abernathy who had answered her advertisement for a governess with a generous offer and a prepaid ticket, was nowhere to be seen. The station was just a wooden platform and a small, dark office. There was no welcome here. The air smelled of coal smoke, manure, and cheap whiskey. From the saloon across the street, a spill of yellow light and rough laughter sliced through the dark. A few figures detached themselves from the shadows and ambled toward the stagecoach, their boots thudding heavily on the boardwalk. They were miners, their faces smudged with grime even in the dim light, their movements loose and unsteady. "Well now, look what the cat dragged in," one of them slurred, his grin showing missing teeth. "A little bird, all the way from back east." May's chin lifted. She had worked as a kitchen helper in a boarding house and as an assistant teacher in a room full of rowdy boys. She was not easily cowed. She ignored them, her gaze sweeping the empty platform for any sign of Mr. Abernathy. Another man stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the sourness of his breath. "What's the matter?" "Little bird, you lost." He reached out a grimy hand as if to touch her hair. May stepped back sharply. Her heel caught the edge of a loose plank on the platform, and for a heart-stopping second, the world tilted. Her suitcase slipped from her grasp, and she pinwheeled her arms, fighting for balance. A hand, strong and steady, closed around her arm, pulling her back from the edge. It was not a rough grip, but a firm, anchoring one. She found herself looking up into the calmest pair of eyes she had ever seen. They were a warm, quiet brown, the color of a riverbed seen through clear water, and they belonged to a man who seemed to be a part of the wind and the dust, not just a visitor passing through it. He was tall and lean, dressed in practical denim and leather, and he moved with an economy that spoke of deep competence. "She's not lost," the man said, his voice as quiet and steady as his eyes. He did not raise it, yet it cut through the drunken haze instantly. He released May's arm and bent to retrieve her suitcase, placing it firmly back in her hand. The miners shuffled their feet, their bluster deflating under his gaze. "Just being neighborly, Avery," one of them mumbled. "Find some other way to be neighborly," Luke Avery said, still in that low, even tone. "Go on, now." The men grumbled but turned and lumbered back toward the saloon, melting back into the noise and the light. The street was quiet again, save for the ceaseless complaint of the wind. "Thank you, Mr. Avery," May said, her voice steadier than she felt. She straightened her bonnet and met his gaze directly. "It's just Luke," he said, a corner of his mouth tilted upward. Not quite a smile, but something close. "You must be Miss Collins, waiting for Abernathy." Hope flared in her chest. "You know him. Is he here?" Luke's expression became guarded. He shook his head. "Abernathy left town a few weeks back. Said he was heading for California." He looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. "Did he make you a promise?" The shame was a hot flush on her cheeks. To be stranded, to be made a fool of. It was worse than the cold. "He offered me a position," He sent the ticket. Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked down the dark street. There's a good boarding house at the end of the road. Caldwell's. Martha Caldwell is a fair woman. She'll see you have a room for the night. He picked up her suitcase. I'll walk you. It was not a question. May found herself falling into step beside him, her practical boots making little sound on the wooden planks. The town was a collection of stark, unpainted buildings hunkered down against the vast emptiness of the land. It's best to be indoors after sunset here, Luke said as they walked, his voice low, especially for women and children. Is it the miners? May asked, thinking of the men at the station. He was quiet for a long moment. That, and other things. There are stories. A creature in the hills. Some call it a werewolf. A few children have gone missing over the years. Never found. May's steps faltered. A werewolf in St. Louis. They had crime and poverty. Tangible dangers one could face with logic and law. Here, they feared monsters from storybooks. She told herself it was just a local superstition, a way to explain the harshness of the land. She believed in reason. In fact, she could see and touch. She did not yet trust the people of the West, with their quiet eyes and their tales of shadow creatures. I see, she said, her tone clipped. They reached a 2-story building with a neatly painted sign that read Caldwell's Boarding House. Lamplight glowed warmly in the front windows. Luke set her suitcase down on the porch. Martha will take care of you, he said. He tipped his hat, a simple gesture, yet it felt more respectful than any of the flowery compliments she had heard back home. Before she could thank him again, he had turned and walked away, his tall frame disappearing into the consuming darkness as if he were just a part of it. The next morning, May learned the full shape of her trouble. Martha Caldwell, a woman with a kind, careworn face and flour on her apron, confirmed that Sam was indeed in the town jail. He's a good boy. You're Sam, Martha said, pouring May a cup of coffee that was more chicory than bean. Quiet, works hard, but he fell in with the wrong crowd. He was accused of robbing a silver transport, May said, the words tasting like ash. Martha nodded, her expression grim. Silas Creed's silver. Creed owns the mine, the freight company, and just about everything else in this town that's worth owning. He doesn't take kindly to people touching his property. Armed with a new and terrible resolve, May walked to the sheriff's office. The building was little more than a small wooden box with a single barred window. Sheriff Tom Reeves was a man in late middle age with a drooping mustache and eyes that refused to meet hers for more than a second at a time. He sat behind a desk cluttered with papers, the tin star on his vest looking tarnished and heavy. Miss Collins, he said, his voice a low rumble, I'm sorry for your brother's predicament. Then you'll release him, May stated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. My brother is not a thief. There must be some mistake. The sheriff sighed and shuffled his papers. There's evidence. A witness saw someone of his description near the canyon where the wagon was hit. We found a kerchief with his initial on it at the scene. A kerchief. That is your evidence. Half the men in this territory could be named Sam or Simon or Saul. Was this witness reliable? He was one of Mr. Creed's men, Reeves said, and looked away. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Silas Creed, the man whose silver was stolen, the man whose employee was the only witness, the man who, according to Sam's letter, had bought the sheriff. May looked at the lawman, at his averted gaze and the slight tremble in his hand as he reached for his coffee cup, and she saw the truth of her brother's words. The sheriff was a man caught between his conscience and his fear, and fear was winning. I want to see my brother, she said, her voice cold as iron. The visit was short and painful. Sam looked younger than his 18 years, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror behind the iron bars. He swore his innocence, told her he was set up, that he'd overheard some of Creed's men talking about shorting the silver shipments and they had to silence him. They're going to send me to the territorial court in Cheyenne, he whispered, gripping the bars. May, You can't let them. People who cross creed, they have accidents on the road. Walking back out into the harsh daylight, May felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She was alone, nearly penniless, and facing a man who held an entire town in his fist. The job with Mr. Abernathy, her one hope for stability, had been a lie, a cruel trick. She now saw the truth with chilling clarity. The letter offering employment had not been a promise, but a lure. Someone, one of Creed's people, wanted her here, perhaps as a bargaining chip, perhaps just to watch Sam's family suffer. The thought made her feel sick, but it also hardened her resolve. She would not be a pawn. She needed to stay. She needed to earn money and find a way to prove Sam's innocence. Her gaze fell upon the small, steeple-topped building at the edge of town, the chapel. It looked dusty and seldom used. An idea began to form. Back home, she had been an assistant teacher. Here, the children ran wild, their futures already pointing down into the darkness of the silver mine. She found the town pastor, a stooped elderly man named Reverend Michael, sweeping the chapel steps. She made her proposal directly. She would open a temporary school, asking only for a small contribution from the families who could afford it, and a place to hold her classes. The Reverend looked at her, his watery blue eyes seeming to see the steel beneath her polite Eastern manners. Most folks here think a child is more useful with a pickaxe than a book, Miss. Then perhaps it is time someone offered them a different choice, May replied. He smiled, a faint, dry sound like rustling leaves. The chapel is yours in the mornings, Miss Collins. God knows it could use the life. The next day, she swept the dust from the chapel, arranged a few rough benches, and drew an alphabet on a piece of slate. 5 children showed up. 2 were Martha Caldwell's, and 3 others were the offspring of miners whose wives held a desperate belief in a life beyond Red Butte. Among them was a girl of about 10, with bright, inquisitive eyes and a braid of sandy hair. Her name was Annie Sutton. While the other children struggled with their letters, Annie was quick and eager. During a short break, May overheard the other children teasing her. Annie talks to ghosts, a boy sneered. I do not, Annie said, her small chin jutting out. It was the Wolfman. He showed me the way home when the dust storm came up. May intervened gently, shooing the other children back to their benches. She sat beside Annie. The Wolfman, she prompted softly. Annie's eyes were wide and utterly sincere. Everyone says he's mean, that he steals children, but he's not. I got lost up in the rocks, and the wind was screaming. I couldn't see anything. Then I saw him. He was tall, and his eyes, they glowed a little, like embers. He didn't say anything. He just stood by a cut in the rock. I was scared, but I was more scared of the storm. I went into the cut, and it was a little cave, out of the wind. I waited there, and when the storm passed, I knew the way home. She looked up at May. He helped me. May looked at the child's earnest face. She didn't believe in glowing-eyed wolf-men, but she believed that Annie had seen something, and that the child's truth was worth protecting. She put an arm around the girl's small shoulders. Well, May said thoughtfully, sometimes help comes from places we least expect. Across the street, mending a bridle in front of the livery, Luke Avery watched the children leave the chapel. He'd seen May confront the sheriff earlier, had seen the determined set of her shoulders as she walked away. Now he saw her emerge with the children, a small flock around a surprisingly resilient shepherdess. He saw her smile at little Annie Sutton, a genuine warmth that reached her eyes. He remembered the feel of her arm, the brief moment he had steadied her on the platform. She was finer boned than the women out here, but there was a strength in her that had nothing to do with muscle. It was in the way she stood up straight when the world tried to knock her down. He had lived his life by keeping his distance, by observing and staying quiet. But as he watched May Collins stand against the relentless Wyoming wind, a woman who had been lured into a trap and now stood to fight it, he felt a pull he had not felt in a very long time. It was the quiet, undeniable recognition of courage. And in a town like Red Butte, courage was a rare and dangerous commodity. The small chapel bell, rung by hand by the eldest of the Caldwell boys, sounded thin but clear in the sharp morning air. It was a call to learning, not to prayer, and it gathered May's small group of students from the dusty street. Inside, she had established an order that was gentle but absolute. Lessons were to be respected, slates were to be kept clean, and no one was to laugh at another's honest answer. She ruled not with a switch, but with a steady, patient gaze that saw more than the children were used to. The story of the Wolfman came up again. During a pause in their arithmetic, Annie Sutton, her face earnest, tried to explain it once more. "He doesn't make a sound when he walks," she whispered to the boy next to her. "Not even the rocks move." The boy, a burly miner's son named Thomas, snorted. "Because he is not real. My PA says it is just a bear." "It was not a bear," Annie insisted, her voice rising. "Bears don't have eyes that shine in the dark." A few of the other children giggled. May stepped forward, placing a hand on Annie's shoulder. "An opinion is not a fact." "Thomas," she said, her voice calm and even, "and Annie is telling you what she saw. We will show her the courtesy of listening, even if we do not understand it." The giggling stopped. May looked down at Annie and gave her a small, reassuring smile. She was protecting not the story, but the child's right to tell it. The truth of a thing was often less important than the truth of the person telling it. That night, the lesson of courtesy was forgotten by the town. A series of sharp cracks echoed from the hills near the Silver Peak mine, waking May from a shallow, troubled sleep. They were gunshots, clean and distinct in the cold, thin air. She went to her window and saw lamps being lit up and down the street. Men shouted in the darkness, their voices carrying a frantic edge. A horse galloped hard down the main road, its hooves striking sparks from the rocky soil. Another robbery. The word spread through the boarding house like a fever. By sunrise, the entire town of Red Butte was buzzing with a nervous energy that felt like a prelude to a storm. Silas Creed had called a meeting in the town square. He stood on the steps of his freight office, a man whose tailored coat and polished boots seemed to defy the dust that coated everyone and everything else. He was handsome in a severe way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a winter sky. He let the crowd of miners and shopkeepers gather, his silence a tool he used to build their anticipation and their fear. Luke Avery stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He watched Creed, but he also watched May as she came to stand near the back, her face pale but her posture resolute. "Friends, neighbors," Creed began, his voice carrying effortlessly over the anxious murmurs. "Twice in as many weeks, we have been violated. Twice, the fruits of our hard labor, the very silver that feeds your families, has been stolen by thieves in the night." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Last night, my men were fired upon. Brave men guarding our livelihood. They drove the cowards off, but not before they made off with another wagon full of silver ore." He let his gaze sweep across the faces before him. "We have been patient. We have trusted in the law." He glanced at Sheriff Reeves, who stood beside him looking profoundly uncomfortable. "But patience has its limits. We now know this was not the work of some passing drifters. This is an organized effort, and we know who is behind it." His eyes found May in the crowd, and he pointed a long, accusing finger, not at her, but in the direction of the jailhouse. "The boy Sam Collins. He is the root of this poison. We caught him the first time, but his Confederates are still out there. Emboldened by his capture, they struck again, trying to free him, trying to steal what is ours." A low growl went through the crowd of miners. They were tired, poor, and frightened men, and Creed was giving their fear a name and a face. May felt a cold fury rise within her. She saw the lie for what it was, a performance for an audience eager to believe. Before she could think, before she could weigh the consequences, she was moving. She walked through the crowd, people parting before her, and stopped at the bottom of the steps, forcing Silas Creed to look down at her. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and precise, carrying the crisp enunciation of her teaching. "You speak of evidence. What evidence do you have that my brother is involved in this second incident? He has been locked in a cell for weeks. Did he somehow direct this attack from behind bars?" A murmur went through the crowd. Creed's smile was thin, patronizing. "Miss Collins, from back east. Are you not? We have a simpler way of seeing things out here. A snake is a snake. You cut off the head, the body still thrashes for a while. Your brother has friends. Then you should be looking for these friends," May countered, her gaze unwavering. "Instead, you stand before these good people and attempt to convict a boy who has not yet had a trial. You use fear as a substitute for facts. Is that the way of the West, sir, to abandon reason so easily?" In her small dress shop across the square, Evelyn Munro paused, a needle hovering over a piece of calico. She watched the small, determined woman in the plain dress hold the gaze of the most powerful man in the territory. "Well, I will be," Evelyn whispered to herself, a slow, grudging smile touching her lips. The canary has claws. Creed's tolerant expression hardened. "You would be wise to mind your tongue. Miss, your concern for your brother is understandable, but do not mistake our hospitality for weakness." He turned his back on her, dismissing her as he addressed the crowd again. "Sheriff Reeves has the authority. He will be petitioning to have the prisoner transferred to the territorial court in Cheyenne, where he can be properly dealt with, away from his accomplices." The message was clear. Sam would be taken away. He would be vulnerable. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, agitated clumps. May stood her ground, feeling shaken but not defeated. A shadow fell over her. It was Luke Avery. "That was a brave thing," he said, his voice quiet, "and a foolish one." "Doing nothing felt more foolish," she retorted, her hands clenched at her sides. "Creed doesn't like to be challenged, especially in public. He'll make you pay for it." Luke's gaze drifted toward the hills that ringed the town. "Stay away from the canyon. Do not go looking for anything. You will not find it, and you will only find trouble." His advice was sound, practical, and born of a genuine concern that she found both touching and irritating. He was trying to protect her, but he was also telling her to give up. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Avery," she said stiffly, and turned to walk toward the sheriff's office. She would make one last appeal to the law. Luke watched her go, a knot tightening in his gut. He knew this land. He knew how to read its signs, how to follow a trail that others would miss. He had been a scout, and the skills, once learned, never left you. He had tried to live a quiet life, raising his horses and leaving the world to its own troubles. But May Collins, with her steady eyes and her refusal to bend, had stirred something he thought was long buried. He looked at the hard, unforgiving line of the hills, then back at the town controlled by Creed's web of power. His advice to May was good advice, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was not going to follow it himself. May's meeting with Sheriff Reeves was brief and disheartening. "My hands are tied. Miss Collins," he said, refusing to meet her eyes as he signed a stack of papers. "Creed wants him moved. The circuit judge will be here in 2 days to sign the order. Then Sam will be on the next stage to Cheyenne." 2 days. The words were a death sentence. She walked out of the office into the fading afternoon light, the weight of the deadline pressing down on her. The sun was setting, painting the underside of the clouds in fiery shades of orange and red. As the shadows deepened in the canyons and hollows of the surrounding wilderness, a sound drifted down into the town. It was a howl, long and mournful, but it was unlike any animal she had ever heard. It had a strange, resonant quality, a mechanical smoothness that made the hairs on her arms stand up. It was not the cry of a wolf. It was the amplified imitation of one, a sound designed to terrify, to play on the superstitions of the townspeople. It was the howl of the wolfman, and in that moment, May understood that the stories of monsters and the reality of men like Silas Creed were somehow connected. She went back to the boarding house, her mind racing. Reason had failed her. The law had failed her. She had 2 days to save her brother. Luke had warned her to stay away from the hills, but his warning was for a woman who had other options. She had none. If there were answers, they were out there, in the cold, dark places where the town's fears were born. She would go and find them herself, miles away. In a shallow arroyo hidden from the main trail, Luke Avery knelt beside the tracks of a heavy wagon. He had not gone to Dry Needle Canyon, the place Creed had named in the town square. A public declaration like that was a lie, a piece of misdirection. A real thief would not have used a main canyon. Luke had circled wide, cutting for sign on the less traveled routes. He had found the trail an hour ago. The tracks were deep, the wheels shod in iron, the kind used for hauling heavy ore. He followed them, his eyes missing nothing. The bent blade of grass, the chipped stone, the faint scent of axle grease on the wind. The trail was difficult, winding through treacherous, rocky ground. It was the work of a skilled driver who knew the land and wanted to avoid being seen. He moved with a quiet purpose, his horse following patiently behind him. The sun was gone, and a cold moon was rising, casting the landscape in shades of silver and black. For nearly 2 hours, he followed the strange, looping path. The wagon had not headed east toward Cheyenne or west into the lawless territories. It had made a wide, senseless circle. Finally, the trail straightened, leading toward a dark shape huddled against the base of a mesa. Luke dismounted. Tethering his horse to a scrub cedar, he approached on foot, silent as a shadow. It was a long, low building, a warehouse he knew had been abandoned for years. But as he drew closer, he saw a faint line of light under the heavy main door. He smelled the unmistakable scent of fresh horse droppings. He circled the building, finding a grimy window at the back. He carefully scraped away a patch of dirt and peered inside. A single lantern cast a pool of yellow light, and in that light, Luke saw it, the wagon. Its bed was still loaded with canvas sacks, bulging with what he knew was silver ore. Standing beside it, talking in low voices, were 2 of Silas Creed's most trusted men. Luke stepped back from the window, the cold of the night air seeping into his bones. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The robbery had been a sham, a performance. Creed had stolen his own silver. He had created an incident to solidify his power, to justify getting rid of Sam Collins, and to tighten his grip of fear on the people of Red Butte. Justice in this town did not begin with a question of why. It began with a lie, and Luke Avery was now the only one who knew it. May had her sturdiest walking boots on and a small sack with a piece of bread and a canteen of water ready before the sun had fully risen. She was slipping out the back door of the boarding house when a quiet voice stopped her. "The hills are no place to be alone." Luke Avery stood by the rain barrel, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He looked as if he had been waiting for her. "I am not asking for company," May said, her chin high. She would not be deterred by another one of his sensible warnings. "I am not asking for permission," he replied, his gaze steady. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "You have the look of a woman who has made up her mind, and I have learned it is easier to walk alongside a storm than to stand in front of it. Where are you going?" "Dry Needle Canyon," she said, surprised at her own honesty. "Mr. Creed was very specific about the location of the robbery. I thought it might be the one place worth looking." "Because it is the one place a real thief would never be," Luke finished for her, nodding in understanding. "My thinking exactly. Let us go." They walked out of the sleeping town, 2 solitary figures against the vast, pink-tinged dawn. The wind was already awake, a restless presence that tugged at May's skirt and sent dust devils dancing across the plains. The entrance to the canyon was a narrow slash in the rock, a place where the shadows clung long after sunrise. As they ventured deeper, the silence became profound, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling high above and the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground. "You walk quiet for someone from the city," Luke observed, his voice low. "I learned to be quiet in a house with 7 boarders and only 1 staircase," May replied, a touch of dry humor in her tone. "It is a different kind of survival skill." He chuckled. "A rare and pleasant sound." "I suppose it is." He pointed to a set of tracks in the sandy soil. "Coyote, not the 4-legged kind." "See how the heel is dug in? Someone was running, carrying something heavy." May watched him, fascinated. He read the story of the land as easily as she read a book, seeing meaning in details she would have overlooked entirely. He was a part of this place, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of trust, not just in his competence, but in him. It was his heightened senses that caught the sound first. He stopped, holding up a hand, his head cocked. May listened. Faintly, carried on a gust of wind, she heard it too, a thin, desperate cry. "This way," he said, already moving, his pace quickening. They found her huddled in the lee of a large boulder, her small body shaking with cold and fear. It was Annie Sutton. Her dress was torn at the hem, and her face was streaked with tears and dust. "Annie," May exclaimed, rushing to her side and wrapping her shawl around the child's trembling shoulders. "What are you doing all the way out here?" "I was looking for Fireleaf," the girl sobbed. "For Papa's cough. I followed a rabbit. And then the wind got angry and I could not find the way back." As May comforted the child, Luke scanned the surrounding rocks, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. A flicker of movement caught his eye, then another, from the crags above them, silent as ghosts. A half-dozen large animals emerged. They were not wolves, and they were not dogs, but something in between. Their coats were the color of dust and shadow, their yellow eyes intelligent and watchful. They were sleek and powerfully built, moving with a predatory grace that sent a chill down May's spine. She pulled Annie closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The animals formed a loose semicircle, blocking their path back to the canyon mouth. Yet they did not advance. They simply stood and watched, their heads low, an unnerving stillness in their posture. They seemed to be waiting. Luke slowly raised his rifle, but he did not aim it. "Easy," he murmured. "Do not make any sudden moves." Annie, surprisingly, was less afraid. "It is them," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "The watcher dogs." The lead animal, a large male with a dark slash of fur across its back, took a hesitant step forward. It lowered its head, sniffing the air. In the clear, bright light, May saw something unnatural around its thick neck. A band of dark metal, wide and heavy, glinted against its fur. As the animal turned its head, she saw a symbol stamped into the collar. It was a simple, stark letter C. Her breath caught in her throat. C for Creed. At that moment, the wind carried a sound from far away, a high-pitched whistle that was barely on the edge of human hearing. Instantly, the animals responded. The lead dog's ears twitched, and it let out a low whine. Then, as one, the pack turned and melted back into the rocks, disappearing as silently as they had come. The canyon was empty again. "What was that?" May whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did they leave?" "That whistle," Luke said. His eyes narrowed in thought as he helped Annie to her feet. "They are trained, not wild." He looked at May. "Those are wolf dogs, a crossbreed, smarter than a dog, more trainable than a wolf. With the right methods, you can teach them to respond to a sound most people cannot even hear, a silent command." The wolfman with the glowing eyes, the creature that guided Annie in the storm, the howl that was not a howl. Pieces began to click into place. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed illusion. "We need to get Annie back to town," Luke said, his voice grim. "But there is something else I need to see first." trusting his instinct. May followed as he led them not back down the canyon, but up a narrow side trail hidden by a stand of gnarled junipers. The path ended at a shallow cave, little more than a dark mouth in the rock face. The air inside was cold and smelled of fuel. Just inside the entrance, stacked neatly against the wall, were several large tins of lantern oil. Beside them was a heavy canvas sack. Luke untied the drawstring and tipped a small amount of its contents into his palm. It was a fine, silvery white powder. "Magnesium," he said, his voice a low rumble of dawning fury. "Burn this in a lantern with the glass removed, and you get a flare of brilliant white light, a light so bright it would seem supernatural, like glowing eyes in the dark." They had found the monster's workshop. Getting Annie home was their first priority. Her father, a gaunt, exhausted miner, wept with relief, crushing his daughter in a hug. He offered them his thanks, his only possession of value, and they refused, assuring him that his daughter's safety was enough. From there, May and Luke went directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Reeves looked up, startled, as they entered, his expression turning wary. "Sheriff," May began, her voice steady and firm, "I am asking you to delay my brother's transfer." "I told you, Miss Collins, the order is coming." "And I am telling you that something is wrong in this town," she cut in, her patience gone. "There are things happening in those hills that have nothing to do with my brother and everything to do with scaring people into submission. You are a man of the law. Is it not your duty to investigate a credible claim?" Reeves shifted in his seat, his gaze flicking from May's determined face to Luke's silent, imposing figure. Luke said nothing, but his presence was an argument in itself. He stood for a kind of justice older and more fundamental than any tin star. "What kind of things?" the sheriff asked, his voice weak. "Just give me time," May pressed, deciding to hold back the details of the magnesium and the collars for now. It was too much to reveal at once. "One day, 24 hours. That is all I ask. If I can find nothing more by then, I will not stand in your way." The sheriff looked at the transfer papers on his desk, then back at May. He was a man drowning in his own fear, but she had just thrown him a thin rope of conscience. With a long, weary sigh, he nodded. "One day." He conceded, "But that is all. 24 hours from sunrise tomorrow." May knew it was not enough, but it was a start. As they left the sheriff's office, a new idea was already taking shape in her mind. She could not just search for clues. She had to change the heart of the town itself. And she knew, from her time as a kitchen helper, that the quickest way to a man's heart was often through his stomach. That evening, the dining room of Caldwell's boarding house was full for the first time in months. May, with Martha's blessing and help, had prepared a simple, hearty beef stew and fresh cornbread. The smell alone was enough to draw in miners who were used to a diet of stale bread and jerky. She charged a modest price, just enough to cover the costs, and soon every table was crowded. The men were quiet and suspicious at first, but the warmth of the room and the honest goodness of the food began to loosen their tongues. They talked of the mine, of low wages, and of the fear that haunted the edges of the town. Someone complained that the telegraph line had been down for a week, cutting them off from the outside world. "Creed's men says it's a wire break-up in the mountains," he grumbled. "Convenient, is it not it?" May moved between the tables, refilling bowls, offering a kind word. This was not a duty, it was a strategy. Kindness was a weapon they would not expect. She was earning their trust, one spoonful at a time. Luke sat at a corner table, watching her. He saw the easy grace with which she managed the crowded room, the genuine smile she gave a child, the respectful way she listened to a miner's complaint. He found himself smiling too, a real smile that reached his eyes. May paused by his table. "It is good to see you smile." "Mr. Avery," she said softly. She noticed a thin, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "You look like a man with a few stories to tell." He touched the scar instinctively. A disagreement with a bear cub's mother, a long time ago. He said, back when I was scouting for the railroad, she was bigger than me, and faster. The easy admission, the hint of a past life filled with a different kind of danger, made him seem more human, more accessible. Just then, the door opened and Evelyn Monroe swept in, a basket of mending held on her hip. The seamstress had a tongue as sharp as her needles, but her eyes missed nothing. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering for a moment on May. She handed the basket to Martha. "That Creed fellow was just down at the stable," Evelyn said, her voice carrying in the relative quiet. "Checking on those beasts of his. It is funny, is it not? I have lived here my whole life, and never saw a wolf that looked like those things. Then, last year, he pays a fortune to some trapper from the Northern Territories to bring a whole pack of them down. Said he wanted guard dogs that looked fearsome." She shrugged. "Looks like he got his money's worth." She turned and left as quickly as she had come. A silence fell over the room as the men processed her words. But May felt a jolt, as if the last piece of a complex puzzle had been slammed into place. The dogs were not a local phenomenon. They had been deliberately imported. The entire legend of the Red Butte Wolfman was a recent invention, a fabrication. And she knew, with absolute certainty, who the author was. Outside, the wind howled, colder now, carrying the first sharp scent of snow. Her 24 hours had begun. The sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise by the time they left the warmth of the boarding house. The wind no longer gusted. It was a solid, pressing force that stole the breath and scoured the skin with invisible sand. Luke Avery looked at the churning, leaden clouds boiling over the peaks. "This is a bad idea," he said, his words nearly snatched away by the gale. "My brother is transferred in less than a day," May Collins replied, pulling her shawl so tight it was a wonder the wool did not tear. "A bad idea is all I have left." He did not argue further. He had seen that look in her eyes before, in the town square when she faced down Silas Creed. It was the look of a person who had calculated the risks and found them smaller than the cost of doing nothing. Their goal was the shallow cave in the hills, the place where they had found the magnesium powder. A sack of that silvery dust would be tangible proof, something Sheriff Reeves could not ignore, a piece of the great lie made real. The journey out of town was a battle. The wind tore at them, trying to push them back. The air grew colder with each step, a biting, invasive cold that found its way through every layer of clothing. The first snowflakes were small and hard, stinging their faces like thrown gravel. Within minutes, the flakes were large and wet and dense, and the world dissolved into a churning whiteness. The trail disappeared. The landmarks, the familiar shapes of the rocks and hills, were erased. Luke took the lead, his body a dark shape against the blinding snow. May followed in his footsteps, her head down, focusing only on the spot where his boots had been. The storm was a living thing now, a shrieking, white beast that consumed the world. She stumbled, her foot catching on an unseen root, and pitched forward. Before she hit the ground, Luke was there, his arms catching her, pulling her upright. The snow was coming so thick she could barely see his face, though he was only inches away. "We cannot make it to the cave," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "We need shelter, now!" He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, and pulled her along. He seemed to be navigating by some internal compass, a sense born of long years spent in the wilderness. He moved with a grim purpose, angling away from the open ground and toward a dark line of trees that was barely visible through the swirling snow. Every step was a struggle. The cold was a physical weight, pressing the air from May's lungs, turning her limbs to lead. Just when she thought she could not take another step, that she would simply sink into a snowdrift and let the white silence take her, a shape loomed out of the blizzard. It was a small, dark square against the white, a hunter's cabin, tucked deep in a grove of pine trees, smoke thick and white. was being ripped from its stone chimney, a sign of recent use. Luke shoved the heavy wooden door open, and they stumbled inside, out of the screaming wind and into a sudden, shocking quiet. They stood for a moment, gasping, their chests aching with the effort of breathing the still, cold air of the small room. Snow melted from their shoulders, pooling on the rough plank floor. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a stone fireplace where the embers of a recent fire still glowed a faint orange. A rough table and 2 stools stood in the center, and 2 bunks with straw mattresses were built against the far wall. It was sparse, but it was shelter. It was life. Without a word, they moved with a shared purpose. Luke knelt at the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life with dry kindling he found in a box by the fireplace. May shed her snow-crusted shawl and began to search the small cupboards. She found a handful of dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, and a tin of coffee. It was not much, but it was everything. As Luke gently blew on the fledgling flames, May saw blood on his hand. A long, shallow cut ran across his knuckles, red against his skin, probably from a sharp rock when he had stumbled in the storm. She went to him, taking a clean handkerchief from her pocket. "Let me see," she said softly. He held out his hand, and she gently cleaned the wound with a bit of snow from the windowsill, then wrapped it tightly with the cloth. Her touch was light and practical. He watched her, the firelight flickering on her focused face. She had a scrape on her own cheek where a wind-whipped branch had caught her. He reached out, his fingers rough and calloused, and gently brushed a snowflake from her hair. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it lingered in the small, quiet space between them. Soon, a proper fire was crackling in the hearth, throwing warmth and a dancing, golden light into the room. The sound of the blizzard outside was a low, continuous roar, a reminder of the death they had so narrowly escaped. The small cabin felt like the only safe place in the entire world. May mixed some cornmeal with water from her canteen, forming small, flat cakes. She laid them on a hot stone at the edge of the fire. The smell of the baking cornbread began to fill the small space, a simple, wholesome scent that spoke of sustenance and peace. It was the smell of a kitchen, the smell of a home. They ate in silence, sitting on the stools, the fire warming their faces. The simple meal of dry cornbread and a few shared mouthfuls of beans felt like a feast. The warmth seeped back into their bones, chasing away the deep, pervasive chill. Outside, the storm raged on, a fury of wind and snow, but inside, there was a profound and gentle quiet. May looked from the fire to Luke's calm, steady profile. In the midst of this desperate fight for her brother's life, trapped in a wilderness that seemed intent on killing them, she felt a moment of unexpected, piercing happiness. It was a guilty feeling, and she pushed it away. She had no right to such a feeling, not while Sam was in a cage. She looked down at the last piece of cornbread in her hand, and then back at the meager supplies. A small, wry smile touched her lips. She spoke softly, her voice half serious, half joke, a quiet statement of fact that carried the weight of a dozen unspoken things. "I can cook." Luke turned to look at her. The firelight played in his eyes. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his serious features. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners where the lines of sun and wind were etched. He let out a low chuckle, a sound of pure, unburdened amusement. And in that moment, looking at her, with the smell of baking bread in the air and the warmth of the fire on his skin, a simple and profound truth settled over him. As solid and real as the stone of the hearth, he had spent years alone, keeping his heart guarded, convinced that a home was a place you lost, not a place you found. He had been wrong, and he knew he had found his home. His smile faded, replaced by an expression of such open tenderness that May felt her breath catch. He reached across the small space between them and laid his hand over hers. his fingers gently closing around her own. The touch was clumsy, uncertain, but it held a world of unspoken promises. "We will get him out. May," he said, his voice a low murmur. "When this storm breaks, we will go back. We will show them the magnesium. We will tell them about the colors, about the whistle. We will make them listen." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. She leaned into his quiet strength, trusting him in a way she had not trusted anyone in a very long time. He looked into the fire, his expression growing distant. "This country, this winter, it takes things," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I had a wife, a long time ago. We had a small homestead up north. The first winter was hard. The snow came early. Like this, the doctor could not get through. The fever, it took her in 3 days." He fell silent, the old pain a visible shadow in his eyes. "I have not been responsible for another soul since. I did not think I was worthy of the risk." He looked at her, his gaze clearing. "I was wrong about that, too." May did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply tightened her grip on his hand, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, a quiet acceptance of his trust. The night deepened. The fire burned low. Sometime after midnight, a new sound joined the howl of the wind. It was a scratch, a soft, deliberate scratching at the cabin door. Luke was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hands. He moved to the single small window, peering out into the swirling darkness. May's heart pounded. She saw them then, fleeting shapes moving through the trees at the edge of the firelight's glow. The wolf dogs. They had been drawn by the light, the smoke, the scent of human life. They began to circle the cabin, silent shadows against the snow. There were 6, maybe 7 of them. They did not attack, did not bark or growl. They simply moved. A tightening cordon of patient, yellow-eyed predators. Luke watched them, his expression tense. "They are not hunting," he whispered. "They are waiting for a command." The whistle, the high-pitched, silent command that controlled them. He knew he could not replicate it, but he had an idea. He found a spent rifle cartridge on the mantelpiece, holding it to his lips. He blew a sharp, piercing note into the night, a sound that was jarringly different from the low moan of the wind. Outside, the lead dog stopped, its head cocked, its ears twitching in confusion. The others halted, looking to their leader. The sound was wrong. It was not the command they knew. Luke blew the note again, sharp and insistent. The dogs whined, a sound of distress and uncertainty. Their training was at war with their instinct, while Luke kept the dogs off balance. May's role was just as vital. She did not scream or cower. She moved to the hearth and began to build up the fire. Log by log, the flames leaped higher, pushing a brighter, bolder circle of light out into the storm. A defiant bastion against the circling darkness. Her hands were steady. Her resolve was a silent, unshakable force. She would hold the line. She would keep the home fires burning. After what felt like an eternity, the dogs began to retreat. Their confusion had overcome their purpose. One by one, they slipped back into the blizzard, becoming nothing more than ghosts in the storm. The immediate danger had passed. A wave of exhaustion washed over May. She leaned against the warm stones of the fireplace, her legs trembling. She needed more wood for the fire to last the night. In a dark corner of the cabin, she found a stack of rough wooden crates. As she pulled a log from the pile, she knocked one of the smaller boxes to the floor. It broke open, spilling its contents. It was not firewood. It was a large canvas sack of white rice. Curious, she ran her hand over the side of the crate. In the dim firelight, she could feel the rough, stenciled letters. She dragged the heavy box closer to the hearth, turning it so the light fell upon the words. Her blood ran cold. Silver Peak Freight. This was not a random hunter's cabin. The lantern oil, the supplies, the very shelter that had saved their lives, it all belonged to Silas Creed. They were holed up in one of his secret supply depots. They were in the belly of the beast. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the world scoured and silent under a blanket of pristine white. The sky was a sharp, aching blue, and the air was so cold and clean it felt like breathing glass. By mid-morning, the people of Red Butte emerged, their shovels scraping against the wooden boardwalks, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The town, which had been held captive by the blizzard, was now held captive by a tense, waiting stillness. May and Luke returned not with shouts and accusations, but with a quiet, unyielding purpose. They did not go to the sheriff. They went to Reverend Michael and asked to ring the chapel bell. It was not a call to worship, but a call to witness. People came. They came out of curiosity, out of boredom, out of a deep, gnawing unease that the storm had only amplified. They filled the rough wooden pews of the chapel, their faces pinched with cold and suspicion. Martha Caldwell was there, her hands folded in her lap. Evelyn Monroe stood near the back, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Sheriff Reeves stood by the door, his face a mask of indecision, a man caught between a crumbling lie and a terrifying truth. When the room was full, May walked to the front, Luke taking a position a few feet behind her, a silent, solid presence. She placed 3 objects on the preacher's simple lectern. First, the heavy metal collar, its stamped letter C catching the light. Second, a small pouch of silvery magnesium powder. Third, the spent rifle cartridge Luke had used as a makeshift whistle. "Yesterday," May began, her voice clear and steady, filling the quiet room, "you were told that my brother and his so-called Confederates were responsible for the troubles in this town. You were told to fear thieves in the night, but the fear you have been feeling is not for a common thief. It has been manufactured. It has been built, piece by piece, to control you." She held up the collar. "This was taken from the neck of one of the animals that hunts in your hills. The C stands for Creed. These are not wild beasts. They are trained animals, imported here for a purpose." She held up the pouch of powder. "This is magnesium. It is used to create a brilliant, blinding light, the light of a ghost, the glowing eyes of a monster in the dark." Finally, she held up the small brass cartridge. "And this is a placeholder for the true tool. A high-pitched whistle, a sound that you cannot hear, but the wolf dogs can. A silent command that tells them where to go, what to do, and who to ignore. A command that can send them to a lost child to guide her to safety, creating a legend of a benevolent monster. A command that can make them appear on a ridge at just the right moment to frighten a lone prospector." A restless murmur went through the crowd. This was not a vague accusation. This was a methodical dismantling of their deepest fears. "The Wolfman is a lie," May said, her voice ringing with conviction. "The robberies are a lie. It is all a stage play, designed to keep you afraid, to make you look to one man for your salvation, the same man who profits from your fear." The chapel door creaked open, and Silas Creed stepped inside. He did not look angry. He smiled, a calm, confident smile that instantly shifted the atmosphere in the room. He walked slowly down the aisle, his polished boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. He stopped beside the lectern and looked at the items May had displayed. "Well, well," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "It seems we have a thief in our midst after all." He turned to the crowd, his expression one of patient reason. "This young woman is very clever. She and her accomplice, Mr. Avery, have indeed uncovered some of my property. This collar is from one of my guard dogs. This magnesium powder is from my supply shed, used for blasting at the mine. They are mine. And these 2, he gestured to May and Luke, stole them." The crowd shifted, their certainty wavering. Creed's confidence was a powerful force. "They have spun a fantastic tale," Creed continued smoothly. "A tale of monsters and secret whistles. But the truth is much simpler. They are trying to create chaos. They are trying to frame an innocent man, myself, to draw suspicion away from the real criminal, Sam Collins. It is a desperate, pathetic attempt to obstruct justice." Sheriff Reeves's face went pale. He looked from Creed's unshakable composure to May's defiant stance, and his resolve crumbled. The power in the room was with Creed. "It is a lie," May said, her voice tight with fury. "Is it?" Creed countered, his smile turning sharp as a knife's edge. "Or is it a lie that a schoolteacher from back east suddenly possesses the tracking skills to find my most remote supply caches in the middle of a blizzard?" The logic was cruel and effective. The crowd began to murmur again, this time with doubt directed at May. Then a small, clear voice cut through the tension. "The dogs are nice." Every head turned. Little Annie Sutton stood on a pew, her small hands gripping the back of the bench in front of her. She looked directly at Silas Creed, her expression one of pure, childlike curiosity. "They did not bite me when I was lost," she said. "The big one with the black fur. He just looked at me. Then he took me to the cave. Just like I said." She paused, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she asked the question that no one else had thought to ask. "But who blew the whistle to tell him to be nice to me?" A profound silence fell over the chapel. Creed's smile faltered for the first time. His men, standing near the back, exchanged uneasy glances. The question was a cannonball of simple, unassailable logic. If Creed's dogs were just guard animals, why would they be trained to rescue a lost child? And if they were, who gave the command on that specific day? The lie, so grand and imposing, had been punctured by a 10-year-old girl. That night, the boarding house was quiet, but it was the quiet of a held breath. May knew that Creed had been wounded, and a wounded animal was the most dangerous kind. She sat in her room, the sheriff's 24-hour deadline now long past, feeling as if she were in the eye of a storm. In the smoky back room of the saloon, Evelyn Monroe was delivering a mended coat to one of Creed's foremen. As she took the man's money, she overheard him talking in a low voice to two other hard-faced men. "Creed wants it done tonight," the foreman said. "No noise. Just grab the teacher. We will keep her out at the old line shack. Once Avery knows we have her, he will tell us where he hid the rest of whatever they found out there." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She finished her transaction with a steady hand and a polite smile, but her mind was racing. She left the saloon and, instead of going to her own shop, she slipped through the back alleys, her heart pounding, and knocked softly on the door of the livery stable where she knew Luke Avery sometimes slept. Inside the boarding house, May was startled by a frantic, whispered knock on her door. It was Martha Caldwell, her face grim in the lamplight. "Get your coat," Martha said, her voice low and urgent. "They are coming for you." Luke sent word. Before May could ask any questions, Martha was pulling her down the back stairs and into the warm, fragrant kitchen. Martha's two boys were there, their young faces serious and scared. "You two," Martha commanded. "Go out front. Start a loud argument about whose turn it is to bring in the wood. Be convincing." The boys nodded and scrambled out of the room. A moment later, a furious and entirely believable shouting match erupted on the front porch. "The back door," Martha said, pushing May toward it. "There is a wood wagon. Get in the back, under the canvas. Do not make a sound." May hesitated. "Martha, you will be in danger." "We look after our own here, child," the older woman said, her expression fierce. "Now go." May slipped out into the freezing night. She found the wagon and scrambled into the back, burying herself under a dusty, rough canvas tarp that smelled of pine sap. A few minutes later, she heard the front door of the boarding house burst open, followed by angry, shouting men. She heard Martha's calm, firm voice denying she knew where anyone was. She heard the children's argument escalate into a mock wrestling match. It was chaos, a beautiful, brave, well-orchestrated chaos. The wagon lurched into motion. Through a small tear in the canvas, she saw the dark shapes of the town slide by. She was safe, for now, thanks to the quiet courage of a boarding house owner, a seamstress, and a group of children. The community was learning to trust each other again. Late the next morning, a telegraph arrived. The line, which had been down for a week, was suddenly operational again. The message was for Sheriff Reeves, but the operator, a nervous young man, was so excited he announced the news to anyone who would listen. The message was from the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. It said that a known outlaw, captured 2 days ago, had confessed to a string of robberies, including the 2 silver shipments from the Red Butte mine. The description of the outlaw's methods matched perfectly. Sam Collins was to be released immediately, with the territory's apologies. A wave of relief and confusion swept the town. Creed was vindicated. May and Luke were made to look like fools. Silas Creed himself was magnanimous in his victory, announcing that he held no ill will and was just glad the true culprit had been found. That afternoon, Evelyn Monroe closed her shop early. She walked to the telegraph office, a small package in her hand. She told the young operator that he had left his spare spectacles at the saloon the night before. While the flustered young man thanked her, she accidentally knocked a wastebasket over with her skirt. As she bent to help him pick up the crumpled papers, her nimble fingers found what she was looking for. Later, in the quiet of her back room, she smoothed out the crumpled piece of paper. It was a draft of a telegram, written on a standard form. The message was identical to the one that had arrived from Cheyenne, but this draft had never been sent. It was covered in corrections and cross-outs, and at the bottom, a faint, telltale smudge of dark blue ink had stained the paper, the result of a careless sleeve. Evelyn had spent the last 5 years mending the clothes of every man in town. She knew fabrics, she knew stitches, and she knew the distinctive, expensive French ink that Silas Creed's personal clerk, and only that clerk, used for all his employer's correspondence. The telegraph from Cheyenne was a lie. It had been written right here, in Red Butte. The lie of the Cheyenne telegram settled over Red Butte like a shroud, choking the fragile trust that had begun to grow. Silas Creed, having been publicly vindicated, moved with the swiftness of a serpent striking. He announced a great hunt. With the so-called outlaw gang now supposedly scattered, he declared it was time for the men of the town to deal with the other menace in the hills. It was time, he proclaimed from the steps of his freight office, to hunt down the Wolfman and end its reign of terror for good. He offered a generous bounty and a free cask of whiskey to all who would join his noble posse. It was a performance of civic duty, a grand gesture of protection, and May knew it was a lie. It was a mission to destroy evidence. Their small alliance met in the quiet of Martha Caldwell's kitchen, the heart of the resistance. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and the sharper scent of desperation. There was Luke, his face grim, a fresh supply of spent cartridges in his pocket. There was Sheriff Reeves, his eyes no longer shifting and uncertain, but filled with a cold, quiet fury. He had been played for a fool, his authority used as a puppet's string, and the shame had burned away his fear. And there was Evelyn Monroe, who laid the crumpled, ink-stained telegram draft on the table like a death warrant. "It never came over the wire," Evelyn said, her voice stripped of its usual sarcasm. "It was written by Creed's clerk. I would know that ink stain in my sleep." That was the final piece. A handful of miners, men May had fed and listened to, stood awkwardly by the door, their hunting rifles held in their hands. They were not many, but they were men who had decided that a warm meal and an honest word were worth more than a rich man's promises. Annie Sutton slipped in last, her face set with a determination that belied her years. "I know a high trail," she said simply. "You can see into the canyon, but they cannot see you." Creed's posse, a loud and boisterous crowd fueled by whiskey and greed, rode out of town half an hour later, heading directly for Dry Needle Canyon. May, Luke, and their small band of conspirators followed minutes after, taking Annie's high trail, moving like ghosts through the rocky terrain that was now dusted with melting snow. They were silent, a stark contrast to the raucous party below them. They were not hunting a monster. They were hunting a man. From their vantage point on the ridge, they watched as Creed's men reached the area near the hidden cave and the secret supply depot. But they were not fanning out to search. Instead, under Creed's direction, they began to work with a strange, methodical purpose. Some men unloaded empty wagons, while others carried the heavy tins of magnesium powder to strategic points along the canyon walls. It was exactly as May and Luke had feared. This was not a hunt. It was a cleansing. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, Creed gave a signal. One by one, his men lit the tins of magnesium. The canyon erupted in an inferno of brilliant, silent, white light. The flares burned with an unnatural intensity, casting distorted, dancing shadows that leaped and writhed against the rock walls. Plumes of thick, white smoke billowed upwards, catching the eerie light and taking on the form of ghostly apparitions. It was a terrifying, theatrical display. A manufactured haunting designed to scare away any witnesses and provide cover for his men to clear out the depot. Creed's men, many of whom believed the local legends, grew unnerved by their own creation. They moved with a panicked haste, their shouts echoing strangely in the illuminated canyon. This was the moment Luke had been waiting for. He put the small brass cartridge to his lips and blew a series of sharp, piercing notes. The sound was thin and strange, cutting through the low murmur of the wind. Down below, the pack of wolf dogs, already agitated by the fire and the shouting, froze, their heads snapped up, their ears twitching. The sound was not the one they knew, but it was close enough to throw their trained minds into chaos. They looked to their handlers, the men who often corrected them with a kick or a curse. Then they looked at each other, their yellow eyes glowing in the magnesium glare. Their pack instinct, warring with their broken training, found a new target. The lead dog, the one with the collar May had seen, let out a savage snarl and launched itself not at the shadows, but at the leg of the nearest of Creed's men. The canyon floor descended into chaos. The dogs, a whirlwind of gray fur and snapping teeth, turned on their masters. The men, caught completely by surprise, yelled in pain and terror. Amidst the pandemonium, no one noticed the small figure on the ridge above. Annie, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of the scene, had crept too close to the edge of the trail. A section of loose rock, destabilized by the melting snow, crumbled under her feet. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of fear, as she slid, her hands grasping for a hold on the sheer rock face. May moved without thinking. She lunged, grabbing the back of Annie's coat just as the girl's feet slipped into open air. She dug her heels in, her muscles straining, and pulled the child back onto the solid ground of the trail, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below, Sheriff Reeves saw his chance. Now he yelled to the miners with him. They scrambled down a steep path, using the chaos as their cover. Reeves drew his pistol, his movements now decisive and sure. He ignored the brawling men and dogs and went straight for the heart of the operation, the supply depot, where Silas Creed was directing the removal of the last of the incriminating evidence. Reeves burst into the depot, a long-abandoned line shack. It is over, Creed. Creed spun around, his face a mask of fury in the flickering lantern light. The shack was filled with canvas sacks of silver ore and crates stamped with his own freight company's logo. Reeves, you pathetic, spineless coward. You have just signed your own death warrant. Creed drew his own pistol, and the small shack exploded with the deafening roar of gunfire. A searing pain shot through Reeves's left shoulder, and he staggered back, but he did not fall. He raised his own weapon and fired back. Luke and May, with Annie safely behind them, were halfway down the path when the shooting started. A bullet whined past Luke's head, and he felt a hot sting as it grazed his temple, drawing a trickle of blood. He ignored it, pushing May behind a large boulder. Inside the shack, the air was thick with gunpowder smoke. Reeves was slumped against a wall, his arm hanging uselessly, but his pistol was still aimed at Creed. Outside, the battle was turning. Creed's men, beset by their own dogs and now a handful of determined miners, were falling back in disarray. May saw the whole scene laid out before her, the undeniable proof inside the shack, the witnesses outside, and the lie burning itself out in the canyon. She saw a lantern sitting on a crate next to a large, open can of fuel oil. An idea, desperate and dangerous, seized her. She was no longer just a woman seeking justice. She was an agent of it. She darted out from behind the boulder, grabbed the lantern, and with all her strength, swung it against the fuel can. The can ruptured, and the lantern's flame ignited the spilling oil. A fireball erupted with a deafening whoosh, a flash of brilliant orange light that illuminated the entire scene for a single, stark moment. Every miner, every one of Creed's men saw it. They saw the depot, they saw the silver sacks, and they saw, clear as day in the flash of fire, the stenciled words on the side of a dozen crates, Silver Peak Freight. The mask was not just off, it had been burned away. His entire world collapsing in a flash of fire. Creed's face contorted with pure, homicidal rage. He turned from the wounded sheriff, raised his pistol, and aimed it directly at the source of his ruin. He aimed it at May. No, Luke's voice was a raw shout. He launched himself from behind the boulder, covering the distance in 2 long strides. He threw himself in front of May just as Creed's gun fired. The impact threw him back against her, a solid, heavy weight. He grunted in pain and crumpled to the ground. A collective roar of fury rose from the miners. They had seen it all. They had seen the fake ghosts, the stolen silver, the cold-blooded attempt to shoot a woman, and the sacrifice of the man who tried to save her. They surged forward. A wave of righteous anger, overwhelming Creed and his few remaining loyal men, tearing the weapons from their hands. It was over. The night fell silent, save for the crackle of the burning oil and the pained groans of the wounded. May knelt beside Luke, her hands frantically searching for his wound. He had been shot in the side, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. His eyes were open, clouded with pain, but they were focused on her. "Home," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Home is wherever you are." Sheriff Reeves pushed himself to his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked at the scene, at the captured men, at the exposed truth. With his good hand, he reached up and unpinned the tin star from his vest. He looked at it for a long moment, the symbol of his failure and his fear. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pinned it back on. Not as Silas Creed's man, but for the first time, as the lawman of the people of Red Butte. He walked over to Creed, who was being held by 2 grim-faced miners. "Silas Creed," Reeves said, his voice ragged but strong, "I am arresting you for robbery, for attempted murder, and for imposing an illegal protection tax on the citizens of this territory to protect them from a monster of your own making." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for the miners who overheard. The fear, the ghost stories, the tax they had all paid for protection, it was all a lie. The monster had a name, and he was standing right in front of them, breathing their air, a mortal man in a tailored coat. And he was no longer frightening at all. The dawn that broke over Red Butte was the color of a healing wound, a tender pink that washed over the snow-dusted peaks and painted the stark street in shades of rose and gold. It was a beautiful, aching light that promised a new day while still holding the memory of the blood that had been shed in the darkness. The return from Dry Needle Canyon was a slow, grim procession. It was not a victory parade. It was the movement of wounded souls carrying the heavy burden of consequence. Luke Avery, his face pale and tight with pain, was laid carefully in the bed of a wagon, a makeshift bandage around his side already soaked through. May sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a small, steady point of contact in a world that had been violently upended. She had torn strips from her own petticoat to pack the wound, her movements deft and sure, her mind blessedly empty of everything but the task at hand. He had tried to protest, to say he could ride, but a sharp intake of breath and a wave of dizziness had silenced him. For the first time, he had to accept help, had to lie still and let others carry his weight. Silas Creed and his remaining loyal men were marched in front of the wagon, their hands bound, their faces a mixture of sullen anger and dawning fear. Sheriff Reeves, his own arm in a sling, his face etched with exhaustion, walked with a straight spine he had not possessed a day earlier. He did not look at Creed. He looked at the town ahead, at the people he had failed and now had to lead. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, drawn by the slow, funereal pace of the returning party. They saw the prisoners. They saw the wounded sheriff. And they saw Luke Avery, a man known for his unshakable competence, lying pale and still in the back of a wagon. The truth spread without a word needing to be spoken. They took Luke to the small room behind the doctor's office, the town's only physician. A man old enough to have served in the Mexican War, was competent but overworked. He cleaned and stitched the wound with a steady hand, remarking that the bullet had passed clean through, a miracle of bad aim and good fortune. May never left the room. She held a basin of water. She handed him clean cloths. She sat in a chair in the corner when he was done, simply watching Luke breathe in the laudanum-laced sleep of the wounded, the fear of what people might whisper, of the impropriety of a single woman attending to a single man, had been burned out of her in the canyon. Her world had been reduced to the essentials: life, death, and the quiet duty of care. While the doctor worked, Sheriff Reeves walked to the small stone building that served as the town jail. He unlocked the door to Sam's cell. The boy scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with fear, expecting the worst. "You are free to go, son," Reeves said, his voice rough with emotion. Sam stared, uncomprehending. He stepped out of the cell as if in a dream and saw May standing in the doorway of the office. She had come the moment she knew Luke was stable. "May," he whispered. She said nothing. She simply opened her arms, and he collapsed into them. The long, terrible weeks of fear and isolation breaking in a single, shuddering sob. He was just a boy, barely 18, who had been caught in the jaws of a machine far too big for him to fight. May held him, stroking his hair, her own tears falling silently onto his thin shoulders. This was the reason she had come. This moment was the end of her long, desperate journey. "I am going to do right." "May!" Sam choked out, his voice muffled against her dress. "I swear it. I am going to learn a trade. I will work for Mr. Avery. If he will have me, I will not cause you trouble ever again." "I know," she whispered. "I have always known." With Creed behind bars, the edifice of his power crumbled. His captured men, facing the grim reality of a territorial judge and a hangman's rope, began to talk. The stories tumbled out, a litany of greed and corruption. They confessed to staging the robberies, to hiding the silver, to planting the pathetic clue of Sam's initialed kerchief. One of the more literate ones even admitted to helping Creed's clerk draft the fake telegram, a final, desperate attempt to cement the lie. Sheriff Reeves, his shoulder throbbing with a dull, constant ache, sent his own message over the newly repaired telegraph wire. It was a simple, factual report to the marshal in Cheyenne, detailing the arrests, the recovered silver, and the need for federal assistance. Then he posted a notice on the door of his office, a plain sheet of paper that announced a town meeting for the following evening. Red Butte began the slow, painful work of healing itself. The one man from Creed's posse who had been killed by the wolf dogs was buried in the small, wind-scoured cemetery. It was a sparse affair, attended only by the preacher and a few of the man's saloon companions. There was no glory in it, only a quiet, somber recognition of a life wasted in service to a lie. The town's economy, so completely dependent on Creed's mine, had ground to a halt. Men who had worked for him, whether out of loyalty or necessity, were now jobless. Resentment still simmered in the corners of the saloon, a few sullen whispers blaming the newcomers for the trouble, but the heart of the town had shifted. Martha Caldwell, seeing the worry and hunger in the faces of her neighbors, did what she had always done. She started cooking. She opened her kitchen not as a business, but as a refuge, using her own supplies and contributions from the few who could spare them. She kept a pot of stew simmering on the stove all day. Anyone who was hungry was welcome. The long tables in her dining room became the town's news center. a place where miners sat beside shopkeepers, sharing a meal and the uncertain future. Justice, May realized, was not an abstract concept. Sometimes, it was as simple and profound as a bowl of hot soup offered without expectation of payment. Evelyn Monroe, her sharp tongue softened by the events of the past few days, also found her own way to contribute. She went through her stock of fabric, the bolts of calico and flannel she had been saving for wealthier times, and she began to sew. She made sturdy shirts for the miners' children who had outgrown their old ones and warm dresses for the little girls. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity, her needle and thread stitching together more than just cloth. She was mending the torn fabric of the community itself, one small, careful seam at a time. A week after the confrontation, Luke was strong enough to sit up in a chair on the doctor's porch. The first thing he did was ask one of the miners to bring him the man who owned a small ranch north of town, a quiet German immigrant known for his patient, gentle way with animals. When the man arrived, Luke made him an offer. The wolf dogs, which had scattered into the hills after the fight, were to be trapped, not harmed. Luke would pay for their care and retraining, to turn them from instruments of fear into the working animals they were meant to be. He was taking responsibility, not just for the dogs, but for the fear they had caused. Life in Red Butte began to find a new, more tentative rhythm. The territorial marshals arrived, took custody of Creed and his men, and began the long, formal process of legal reckoning. Their presence was a comfort, a sign that the small, isolated town was part of a larger world with laws and consequences. May reopened her school in the chapel. More children came this time. Their parents, seeing the world change around them, began to see the value in a different kind of future for their sons and daughters. Annie Sutton was there every day, her sandy hair pulled back in a neat, tidy braid that Evelyn Monroe had taught her to make. She was a bright, eager student. One afternoon, May stood beside her as Annie carefully, painstakingly formed the letters on her slate. She had been practicing one word over and over again, the most important one she had yet learned. With a final, triumphant scrape of the chalk, she finished, H-O-M-E. She looked up at May, her face beaming with pride. In that small, perfect word, May saw the culmination of everything they had fought for. It was not just a place. It was a feeling of safety, of belonging, of a future that was not dictated by fear. That evening, as the sun set and painted the buttes in the same soft, rosy light as the dawn that had followed the darkest night, Sheriff Reeves stood on the boardwalk outside his office. He watched the lamplight begin to glow in the windows of the town. He saw Martha Caldwell's boys carrying in wood for the kitchen stove. He saw Evelyn Monroe lock the door to her shop, a new dress for a small child draped over her arm. He saw the lights of the chapel go out as May finished her day's work. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands, a gesture of quiet, profound respect. He was not just the law. He was a part of the town, one of the many threads in a newly woven tapestry. The scars remained, and the winter would be hard, but Red Butte had found its heart again. The great Wyoming winter finally broke its grip. The snow, which had for months been a tyrant, became a servant, melting into the thirsty earth and swelling the creeks with the song of its retreat. The high prairie, brown and dormant, began to blush with the faint, tender green of new life. The wind, which had been a blade, softened into a caress, carrying not the scent of ice but the rich, damp smell of thawing soil and the promise of rain. With the spring came a new sense of order to Red Butte. The territorial government, having seen the depth of Silas Creed's corruption, took an active interest in the small, battered town. They funded the establishment of a proper schoolhouse, a simple one-room building of fresh-cut pine that smelled wonderfully of sawdust and new beginnings. May Collins was formally appointed as its teacher. She now had a real blackboard, a full box of chalk, and a salary, however modest. That was her own. The children came to her not as a temporary refuge from the mines, but as the town's best hope for a future that was not dug out of the dark. Luke Avery, his wound now a puckered, healing scar on his side, had worked through the last of the cold months to bring his horse ranch back to life. He had a new string of Mustangs, wild and beautiful creatures he was patiently gentling. And he had a new hand, Sam Collins, eager and hard-working, had taken to the life with a natural grace. The work was hard, but it was honest, and under Luke's quiet tutelage, the boy was becoming a man. The haunted, fearful look was gone from his eyes, replaced by the steady confidence of someone who has found his purpose. To mark the first day of planting, Luke invited their small, forged family to the ranch. It was a celebration of survival, a quiet testament to the life they were building from the ashes of Creed's reign. Martha Caldwell arrived with a freshly baked apple pie, her face wreathed in a genuine, happy smile. Evelyn Monroe came too, presenting May with a bolt of dark blue cloth for a new school dress, remarking with her typical dryness, "A town's teacher cannot be seen in a dress that has been singed by an oil fire. It sets a bad example." It was the closest Evelyn would ever come to a declaration of affection, and May understood it as such. The children, led by a beaming Annie Sutton, explored the ranch with wide-eyed wonder, chasing chickens and marveling at the long-legged foals that kept close to their mothers in the corral. The heart of the celebration was the small, sturdy ranch house Luke had built with his own hands. The kitchen was warm and filled with light from a window that looked out over the rolling grasslands. A large pot of beans simmered on the stove next to a skillet of sizzling bacon. May moved about the space with an easy familiarity, adding a pinch of salt here, a stir of a spoon there. It felt less like visiting and more like coming home. Luke was working at the window, a hammer and some nails in his hand. The frame had been knocked slightly askew by the force of the blizzard that had trapped them in the hunter's cabin. He was carefully, methodically, setting it right. He worked with a quiet competence, his movements economical and sure. He was not just fixing a window. He was mending the last broken piece of the storm. He was securing his home against any future gales. They ate outside on a long table made of planks set over sawhorses, the brilliant spring sun warm on their faces. The food was simple, but it was a feast. They talked and laughed, their conversation easy and unburdened. They were no longer allies in a desperate fight, but neighbors sharing a meal. After they had eaten, while the children played a game of tag in the new grass, May and Luke stood together in the kitchen, washing the dishes. The comfortable silence was broken only by the clink of plates and the soft sigh of the prairie wind through the newly repaired window. May dried her hands on a towel, her heart feeling full to bursting. She looked at Luke, at the quiet strength in his face, at the way the light from the window caught the silver in his hair at the temples. She thought of how far she had come, from the lonely, frightened woman on the stagecoach platform to this moment of profound peace. She felt a surge of shy, hopeful affection. "Are you still hungry?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, a question that was not about food at all. Luke turned from the window, his work finished. He smiled, that slow, genuine smile that still made her heart catch in her throat. He crossed the small space between them and took her hands in his. "Yes," he said, his voice as quiet and deep as the river that ran through his land. I am hungry for a home." He did not need to say more. She saw it all in his eyes, the future they could build, the life they could share. They began to talk, their words coming in a soft, eager rush, planning not just their own lives, but the life of the town they had claimed as their own. "We could have a public meal every Sunday, here at the ranch," May suggested, her eyes bright with the idea, for any of the family still struggling, just like Martha did. "And the new barn needs to be built," Luke added, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Sam can help. He will learn the trade from the ground up. He will have a skill that no man can ever take from him." "And Annie," May said, her voice full of warmth. "She is so bright. Luke, she could be a scholar, a writer. We should petition the new town council, ask them to set aside a small fund, a scholarship, so she can continue her education when she is older. They were not just dreaming, they were building. They were taking the pain and the fear of the past and using it as mortar to build a stronger future for everyone. May looked around the warm, sunlit kitchen, at the sturdy walls that held back the vast emptiness of the prairie, at the man who stood before her, his hands holding hers as if he would never let go. She thought of that terrible, wonderful night in the snowbound cabin, the night that had changed everything. She looked into his eyes, and with a small, confident smile, she spoke the words that had started it all, not as a joke this time, but as a promise. "I can cook." Luke's expression softened, and his grip on her hands tightened. He leaned in, his voice a quiet murmur that was meant only for her. "And I know I have found my home." The window was open, and a gust of wind, sweet with the scent of distant rain and new grass, swirled into the room, a blessing from the wild land that had tested them and had, at last, welcomed them. A few days later, the stagecoach brought the mail. There was a letter for May, a thick, important-looking envelope with a return address from the Territorial Education Board in Cheyenne. She opened it with a sense of detached curiosity. Inside was a formal job offer. Impressed by the reports of her work in Red Butte, the board was offering her a position as a senior instructor at the Cheyenne Ladies Academy, training new teachers for the entire territory. It was a position of prestige, of influence, a path to a career she could never have dreamed of in St. Louis. She read the letter twice, a year ago. She would have wept with joy. It was everything she had ever thought she wanted: respect, security, a purpose defined by her intellect. She folded the letter and placed it on the table. She looked out the window of the boarding house at the town of Red Butte. She saw Sam, laughing as he shod a horse in the livery. She saw Evelyn Monroe, showing Annie how to thread a needle on the boardwalk in front of her shop. She saw Sheriff Reeves, tipping his hat to Martha Caldwell, and in her mind's eye, she saw Luke, standing on the porch of his ranch house, looking out over the land, waiting. She had come west seeking justice for her brother, and a small measure of freedom for herself. She had found both, but she had also found something she had never known she was looking for. She had found a family, forged not by blood, but by fire and snow and courage. She had found a community that was learning to heal. She had found love. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. Her rejection of the offer was polite, respectful, and firm. She had found her work here. She had chosen her home over a career, a community over a title. She had learned that the greatest stories are not about defeating a villain, but about what you choose to build in the quiet, hopeful days that follow. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so our stories can be heard by more people.